Welcome to Indie Conversations. This is the video series from CSIF, your local supporter of independent film here in Calgary, Alberta. I am on the line right now talking with Lowell Dean about his film that he wrote and directed called Dark Match. So, Lowell, I'm going to get you to do the heavy lifting here. What is Dark Match about?
I should know this by now. I should have it down. Dark Match is a horror film about a ragtag group of amateur wrestlers who are, they're all trying to get more respect, get higher up in their craft, and make it to the big leagues. They accept a deal that they probably shouldn't, that a well-paying gig in the middle of nowhere. And it turns out that gig is being run by a mysterious cult who has dangerous designs for their event.
It's your normal Saturday evening, is what we're trying to say.
Very normal small town wrestling event. It's a ridiculous premise, but we take it very seriously, and it's born out of my love of 80s wrestling and Satanic Panic.
Well, that's what I was about to ask you. Like, it feels to me that if you're going to make a film that is this much involved with like local indie wrestling or like indie wrestling in general, that there must be a love of it from somewhere. So where does that love of wrestling start for you?
I think it starts in childhood. I was a WWF kid. You know, I loved Junkyard Dog and Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior, and I mean, you come up with all these big personas, and then my kind of story with how Dark Match came to be is I actually kind of fell out of wrestling, got into other things, got into film, got into horror, and in my 30s, a friend invited me to something called High Impact Wrestling in Regina, and I wasn't interested in going. I was a little too highbrow at that point in my life, and I was dragged along to it, and it rekindled my love immediately. I went from sitting on my hands to standing and screaming. That was enough to plant the seed of I love wrestling, and wrestling's like a cult, and that was my light bulb moment for turning it into a horror film.
I mentioned before we started this interview how I am this closeted wrestling fan because I think that when it hits, when there is a great performance, when there's that great match with like crowd involvement, there's really nothing quite like it because it like incorporates all these different elements, part sports, park acrobatics, part like theater in the round. It's all of these things mixed together, and it can really hit, emotionally, theatrically, in a way that I'm somewhat interested that outside of like a handful of films, I grew up with like Ready to Rumble. Of course, there was like Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler. Why more people haven't decided to use wrestling as their basis to tell a story that they want to tell?
I don't know the answer to that. I felt the same way when I started writing this. I thought, am I missing something? Is there just like a rule that you don't make wrestling movies or wrestling horror movies? Because to me, I am always in search of a great mashup. To me, I think that is where a lot of true originality for modern film can come, is not in saying, oh, I'm making a Western, but what kind of Western have we never seen, for example? So for me, the idea of a wrestling horror film felt like low hanging fruit. And I was looking around definitely over my shoulder, like, has no one done this? Do people not do this? And the story I wanted to tell and the way I wanted to tell it, I didn't feel like there was any sacred ground I was treading on. It felt open for me.
Let's talk about then the horror element of this film. So where does your love of horror start?
I think my love of horror starts in childhood. Probably like many people, there's a boogeyman under the bed, or you see a movie too young that you shouldn't see, and it traumatizes you, and then it excites you. So for me, it was like that with Jaws. Jaws was the first film I saw that for sure too young, I thought, and I wasn't afraid of going in the ocean. I was afraid of having a bath. It's like there could be a shark anywhere. So I would say that was the beginning for me
They don't
of
tell you a
horror.
lot about those tub sharks. They do exist, I think, out there.
I would have advocated for that, or maybe I just didn't want to have a bath when I was a kid. That was the beginning, and then when I got my hands on a video camera around like age 6 or 7, I think my brain started going to, how do I make other people feel these things that I felt? How do I traumatize others?
You already mentioned like the satanic panic undercurrent that goes through this. I also lived through that time period. Did you do any like other research around that, or did you just use like your remembered experience?
I mean, I listened to a couple podcasts, and I'd watched some documentaries recently. So But I mean, I didn't pull from any one specific thing. I think it's just that memory of people using it as a catch-all if there was a problem, much
Mhm.
like, the witch trials centuries earlier, right?
Right.
Like, oh, you're not adhering to what society wants right now. Well, maybe you're a witch, or maybe the devil made you do it. And to me, I love the idea of wrestling fans and how you could take that a step further. And I think we live in a society and a time when people are very eager to be told what to do and not have to do too much research into it. It's like,
Sure.
tell me in
Sure.
140 characters or less why I should devote my life to this new religion. So I was interested in that.
I would love to hear more about like the cast and crew that you assembled for this project. I'm probably going to butcher this a little bit, but this stars Ayshia Issa.
So she's a Canadian actor. She's great. She's probably most known for the series Transplant. She was one of the first people cast, and I was very nervous about casting the role of Misbehave, who is our lead, because she has to be a great actor, but she also has to be a fighter. And a producer friend of mine, actually, Lord McKinley, who I was in a lab with, said, I know the person who can play this role. And because I was very nervous. And the rest of the cast is really made up of either actors first or wrestlers first.
Well,
But
that's
Aisha
what I
has to
was
do both.
wondering because I mean, you could kind of go both ways. It's like, do you search for a wrestler who you think you can pull off this role, or do you find an actor who you think can pull off the wrestling well? I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that.
No, I don't think there is a right or wrong. But to me, it was, as the writer of the script, I just like did like an inventory of the character, and I would say, how much screen time do they have, and what's the most important thing when I close my eyes? Do I think of like an emotional beat or a line delivery that they have to do, or is it like the physicality of a match? And that's how I cast the film. Right down the line is, this has to be a wrestler. And you wavered a little bit here and there, but by and large, I knew Mean Joe had to have like a performance weight. So Stephen Ogg, for example, but Enigma, for example, was never going to speak, but I needed someone with obviously very expressive eyes and who was great physicality, and not just fighting physicality, but performance physicality. So Mo Jabari, who was actually a Calgary wrestler, Kid Chocolate, he was the man for that job.
Like you have Chris Jericho involved in this as well, so it's like you are getting some big names from the wrestling world to be involved in this project.
Chris Jericho was one of the last people cast because we knew we needed a certain pedigree of performer. And we were all hyper aware, myself and the producers, that to make a quote unquote wrestling horror film, you should have at least one professional, well known global wrestler in the film. And we debated whether Mean Joe should be the wrestler or the prophet, the cult leader should be the wrestler. Ultimately, we leaned into the cult leader, and I think Jericho, having like a overview of wrestling culture and a history with wrestling, he had a very specific idea of how he would want to tackle it, and he also really responded to the material. So it was
Well, I
really
mean, I
fun. It
think
was
it's
an
a
ironic commentary.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a great choice. You've picked someone who has remained relevant for 30 plus years in the wrestling industry, so that does bring a bit of credibility into the feeling of this film too. I want to know about the filming locations. How did you find the places to film these wrestling matches?
We filmed this in Edmonton, and that's where Department Nine, the company behind the film, is set up. Originally, we wanted this to be like at a summer camp kind of location, and we were going to shoot in summer, and it was going to be like barnyard wrestling. It then shifted to winter, and we ended up looking for just eccentric places. And instead of a bunch of cabins, we found this bizarre 70s mansion on the outskirts of Edmonton that we shot a lot of our stuff at. And for the actual matches themselves, without giving too much away, these are not standard wrestling matches. We do a lot of bizarre things with the elements, like water and fire and so on. So we had to find a location that it couldn't be a conventional soundstage. We needed to get a fire marshal in and get a location approved. And we
Right.
ended up going in an abandoned and soon to be demolished auction building. And so that's where we spent 2 weeks in a building where I don't know if I would have wanted to spend 2 weeks for my physical health in the building, but we all wore masks anyway because it was COVID, and did what we had to do.
There's always something that you learn on each project that you do. What was the biggest learn, I guess, that you got from making Dark Match?
Probably too many lessons to count, but the importance of scheduling, the importance of preparation. And these are not things that we failed at in any stretch on this film, but these were things that were really reinforced to me, that there are no shortcuts. You know, this was a really ambitious film. And I think that was probably my biggest lesson, was really scrutinizing what's on the page versus what you're going to end up shooting. Because to me, going in, I was like, oh, this is going to be a fun film. We have a few fights, but they're all contained in a ring. How hard could it be? And the more seasoned members of the crew were like, this is going to kill us, this film. So be prepared.
Who are the biggest people that you want to thank for helping you get this across the finish line?
Again, probably the list is too long, but my biggest collaborator for sure on this was Kareem Hussein, director of photography. He and I had never worked together, and he was someone who was a real big ambassador for preparation. I mean, he's done Brandon Cronenberg's films, Hobo with a Shotgun. He's a really strong DP in the genre world, and just on his own 2 feet with talent and skill. But he was someone who I feel like I was arm in arm with for the whole battle of making this film. And I mean, then, we've got like a great Alberta crew. Myron was our production designer. Tracy was on costumes. Jean actually is from Montreal. He was our stunt coordinator. So it's like my friend Emerson did makeup effects. It's an army, as you know, to make a movie. And there was just a big group of people all playing really hard at the top of their game. Because this film was really ambitious.
It feels like this is a movie that I'll be hooting and hollering in. Like, it just is a good crowd experience. I feel it's a good experience to like sit at your house, watch this alone, but it's a completely different experience to be able to go to a theater, see it with a bunch of people, and get that energy up around it. And I think this would be a great thing to check off on the person's list if they're attending the festival.
This is a crowd movie. I would say, like, I'm proud of the film, and I think it would play hopefully well, even with your lights down on a Saturday night on your couch. But this will hit differently in a packed theater. It is a crowd movie, much like the sport that inspires it. I think this is a wrestling fan's horror film. And it's not, a wrestling film. It's a horror film first and foremost. But there are going to be big crowd moments.
My last question that I'm going to have here for you, it doesn't necessarily have to be a recent film. I'm just going to ask blanketly, what's the last great thing that you saw?
The last film I saw and really enjoyed was Love Lies Bleeding. I just watched that whenever it was in the theaters, like maybe 3 weeks ago. And I quite enjoyed that. I was like, oh yeah, I'm just really, whenever I see something very original and, that plays in a certain era and feels like it's working on its own level, I get really excited. It's like I didn't know anything about it. It wasn't part of the franchise. I loved it.
Well, Lowell, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to do this.
Thank you. Appreciate the chat.